Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar today on strengthening cybersecurity through exposure and vulnerability management. My name is Danyel Loyd-Tate and I am a lead product marketing manager for LevelBlue. I drive the go-to-market strategy for our consulting and professional services portfolio, as well as exposure and vulnerability management. Joining me today in our discussion is Bindu Sundaresan, who is the Director of Consulting and Professional Services for LevelBlue. Bindu excels in customizing information security strategies to support business growth. Her extensive experience includes shaping enterprise security visions, strategies, and programs for Fortune 50 companies, ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets, thereby protecting and enhancing significant revenue streams. Our third presenter joining us today is Clint Harris, who's an Associate Director for LevelBlue Consulting and Professional Services. Clint is a 25-year information security veteran and has held several leadership positions within worldwide security and compliance practices. He advises customers on complex security initiatives by providing both strategic and tactical recommendations to help mitigate risk, reduce overall threats to customers' information security. He has assisted multiple Fortune 100 organizations in assessing their overall levels of compliance, as well as architecting enterprise remediation programs for heterogeneous teams in complex and diverse environments. All right, so now that you know a little bit about us, let's get started with today's presentation. So today we'll be discussing the evolution of vulnerability management into a more comprehensive approach. We'll be examining why traditional vulnerability management is expanding and discuss the strategic shift towards integrating exposure management. From there, we'll outline what a programmatic approach looks like in practice, not just as a technology implementation, but as a holistic security program. We'll share how this approach can impact various security functions across your organization, and we'll discuss what LevelBlue offers for exposure and vulnerability management. Finally, we'll wrap up with a couple of key takeaways and open the floor for some questions. If at any point during our presentation you have any questions, place them in the chat box and we'll make sure we'll include them at the end of the presentation. So let's start by examining why traditional vulnerability management approaches are no longer sufficient in today's threat landscape. First and foremost, we're seeing an unprecedented complexity and rapid expansion of attack surfaces that have overwhelmed traditional defenses. This expansion is driven by several factors: digital transformation initiatives, widespread cloud adoption, proliferation of mobile and IoT devices, such as remote work becoming a norm and having to manage the different types of operating systems and device. Another is an increased reliance on third-party infrastructures. Traditional vulnerability management primarily focuses on known CVEs, but this approach has significant limitations as it fails to address the comprehensive risk picture that organizations are facing today. We're seeing new regulations and increased enforcement driving investments in this area. Regulations like DORA, NIS2, and SEC requirements are demanding more robust approaches to vulnerability management. And all at the same time, breach costs continue to rise year over year, placing financial pressure on organizations. The cyber insurance market has responded with more exclusions and higher premiums. And finally, organizations are increasingly concerned about their supply chain as they observe vulnerabilities affecting their competitors and their suppliers that could potentially impact them as well. So this next slide illustrates the expanding attack surface that organizations must now defend and why we're seeing traditional security approaches are no longer sufficient. Your organization's attack surface has expanded far beyond on-premise environments to include cloud services, SaaS applications, identity systems, APIs, remote endpoints, digital supply chain elements, and even social media presence. This comprehensive view shows why modern exposure and vulnerability management must provide visibility across all layers, from its core internal to the extended digital ecosystem where your data and your brand are increasingly exposed. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bindu and Clint to talk through what this evolution to exposure and vulnerability management look like. Bindu?
Yep, great. Thank you so much, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's start off with sort of this journey, if you will, on how did we get here, right? So for years, as organizations have relied on vulnerability management, we talk about identifying the vulnerabilities, patching the security flaws, then cyber threats continue to evolve. So our approach definitely has to evolve, right? So what we are talking about today is that evolution towards a more proactive security strategy, which is basically exposure management. But the starting point, we have to look at where we came from. And like Daniel was talking about, that traditional vulnerability management focused on scanning for vulnerabilities. We would rank them by severity, usually the CVE scores. Then you'd apply the patches accordingly. For those of us that have been in this space for a long time, we all remember the high, medium, low rankings, the heat maps. We would do, patching based on what the priorities looked like. It was effective in theory, but in practice, it did have some major blind spots, right? So what are those? So if you think about it, it was lacking business context. We were focusing pretty much on known vulnerabilities, and we had really limited asset visibility, right? So given, Clint and I were just chatting about with Daniel when we started this, it's been sort of 5 years since COVID, around this time frame. And, our asset and overall attack surface has significantly evolved, right? So 5 years ago, we wouldn't be talking so much about cloud, IoT, third-party integrations. So the attack surface definitely expanded beyond the traditional vulnerability management tools. And given that vulnerability management alone was not enough, we also saw that, a slew of ransomware attacks, we saw zero-day exploits, we saw supply chain breaches. Then that sort of begged that question, right? Are we really secure just because we are following this sort of CVE cycle and patching them? Obviously, the malicious actor wasn't waiting for security teams to catch up, right? They weren't just exploiting flaws or abusing misconfigurations, exposed credentials. They were, really not focused on the mindset that we had in terms of how vulnerability management operated. And then definitely the evolution there is towards what we are calling the exposure management. Again, is this all net new? No. But the evolution is key because today we can't go back to our old ways of just, doing the whole scanning and patching and just go by prioritizing based on just CVE scores and then focusing only on known CVEs. But we have to evolve from there, right? So this is not just about ranking vulnerabilities by severity. You really have to prioritize all of your security initiatives and map it back to real world risks based on threat intelligence. So the context becomes key. And we also want to look at what we would call a continuous real-time process with the ability to reduce risk as we go along. So the future, as we stand today, is about exposure management, a life cycle based approach, and gone are the days that we would just be sort of compliance focused and look at it from the point of view of, hey, am I complying with HIPAA? I'm complying with PCI, and I have the scope defined for those assets. Have I patched them? Clean patch cycle, good to go, right? We have to really, come into the current world, which is all about continuously focusing on exposure, risk, vulnerabilities, and compliance. And that's really only possible if we really look at it from a life cycle approach, right? We talk a lot about people, process, technology being part of cybersecurity. This is real life application of that. With that, we can look at our next slide, where we'll dive deep into each of the phases of this program. And it's a choice of word here for sure. This is not just a one-time initiative, right? This is not just something that you're buying a new tool for and you're good to go because now you've bought that tool for it. So we'll go into some real life experiences that we have with customers that we're supporting for this, and we'll tag team between Clint and myself. So talk about each of these phases. I will open it up for discussion and we can talk through some of the things that we are seeing. So let's start with scope, right? Seems simple. You're really defining what your program's reach is. So before you can manage exposures, you definitely need to identify what is it that we're protecting, right? So that step is very, very essential. So whether it's your scope of whether it's the cloud, on-prem assets, your endpoints, your third parties, or all of the above, you really want to define that scope. And oftentimes we see organizations overlook assets that actually expand their attack surface. So if you don't have your scope clearly defined, your exposure management efforts are going to be fragmented as well as reactive. So Clint, let's chat about this one. So from a scope perspective, what would you say are the best practices in terms of how do we go about defining this?
I think there's a couple of things. When we talk about assets, you not only want to think about, your hardware assets, but also your software. And you mentioned a variety of different environments, right? So it needs to be, you need to include your on-prem, your public clouds, your SaaS-based applications, et cetera. Really to map all that out and to do it consistently and have an up-to-date inventory of all of that, you're going to need a selection of different kinds of sensors out there. So traditionally, we've seen a lot of clients, and they're going to deploy maybe an active scan engine and a vulnerability management solution, and at periodic times they'll do a discovery scan. That's an okay way to do it, and I think active scan engines are important. But it's also you need that real time. Once you get out towards the edge, we get to remote desktops, things that may not always be online like a traditional server or desktop. It's important to have kind of that always on continuous monitoring. So a hybrid approach to the sensors you're even using for asset management is important. Typically in our more mature clients, we see a combination of agents, passive and active scan engines, and that really allows a real-time or a near real-time view of both all of the hardware as well as the software that's part of any environment within an organization. And I would also say a lot of those different types of sensors and having that near real time really can help with compliance and security framework controls that require maybe monitoring for rogue assets or something like that.
Yeah, so that's great. So for us to be able to really establish this program with the right foundation, we need to be able to define that scope accurately, which is possible usually by a combination of scanners and as well as active and passive sensors that you want to deploy. And then let's get into sort of the discovery, right? So what happens in the discovery is definitely more than just scanning for vulnerabilities, right? So when we're looking at exposure management, we are going to be looking at misconfigurations, human behavior risk, weaker security controls. So, talk to us about, what you've seen when customers that we, help with the exposure management related services. What are some of the gotchas that we should be aware of in that discover phase?
In the discovery phase, we really want to provide the right type of scans, and we want to also, of course, make sure that we're doing that in a continuous or nearly continuous manner. So that hybrid approach to the sensors really applies not only to the to the asset discovery, but also to the exposure discovery phases. So I would say make sure that you have a hybrid approach to your sensors that provide that near real-time view of everything within an organization, all the different environments. But also above and beyond just trying to find, let's say, vulnerabilities, associated with CVEs and common security misconfigurations. It's really a good practice here because we're going to prioritize later on. So, in this stage, not only do we want to scan for, known vulnerabilities and common security misconfigurations, but also incorporate some baseline scans that may include security frameworks like CIS, NIST, or ISO, as well as some compliance mandates that an organization may be in scope for, maybe PCI DSS controls, things like that. So really getting a rich set of baselines across your entire environment, I think, is super important before you go into that next phase as part of this discovery.
That's great. Yeah, and then let's talk about when we talk about this whole exposure management versus its evolution from the vulnerability management. one key element is understanding of that risk and making decisions based on risk, right? So we all know not all exposures are equal. And we said we are moving away from just doing the severity scores. We want to consider real world exploitability, existing security controls that organizations have invested in, the business impact and the context. And as security teams today, we're all having to do more with less, right? So there's this overwhelmed teams, thousands of vulnerabilities. So how do we help them focus on what is most likely to be exploited? How would we go about the prioritizing phase?
I think that's a good point. I think this is really the phase where we've seen a lot of organizations have made the most trouble. So once you've got that data from your scans itself, you've got your asset inventories, you really want to contextualize it. What do you have in your environment? By integrating these threat intelligence feeds as part of your program, you're going to be able to see not only what's out there and what's being actively exploited, but also where those exploits kind of cross over into your environment. So I think that's really important. You're going to be able to detect like advanced attack vectors and even some zero-day vulnerabilities. On top of that, though, it's really important to prioritize the assets themselves so that you can balance those against the particular severities of any weakness or vulnerability. So by going through and applying a risk scoring methodology to all the assets you have that's associated with their business criticality, you can come up with a really simple formula to deduce the risk in any particular asset given any particular weakness. So this prioritization phase sometimes may seem a little overwhelming, but I think overall it's really the most beneficial phase in that it lets you really it helps organizations focus so they get the most bang for their buck out of the remediation mitigation stages later on.
Yeah, that's great. So I think some of those practical tips for risk-based decision making is key. Okay, now we know our scope. We have identified what our risks look like. We have prioritized them. How do we go about understanding that these risks that we have identified is something that is going to get exploited, and how is our defense doing against it? So we are trying to validate, what our attack path would look like. And then, let's talk about, let's say I have a customer who says, hey, there's this vulnerability that seemed like a low risk, but we analyze the attack path. And now we realize how this is a foothold for lateral movement across some critical assets. How do we go about validating this?
I will say, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record, right, that continuous dynamic assessment process is important. You want to continuously do that, not only internally, but it's really beneficial even for really mature cybersecurity programs and organizations to use like third parties, do things like continuous pen testing and red teaming. You kind of want that external audit view, that third-party assessment that really validates your exposure management strategy itself. They can go down, the more esoteric kill chains and really illustrate the true risk that may be part of any one given weakness or vulnerability in the organization when they're chained together. So using, like, for instance, red team to simulate those real-world attacks, and then also monitor how the security controls, personnel, and processes detect and respond to those is really important, I think, in this validation stage.
Yeah, and I think truly, I think exposure management being that continuous life cycle versus a one-time fix, right? And that is why this visual, and for us to be able to shift away from a vulnerability-focused, security culture to an exposure-focused security, you are able to, as an organization, reduce risk in a way that helps you be proactive, business-aligned, and effective. And ultimately, I think the difference between a traditional vulnerability management program versus an exposure management is simple, right? It's not just about knowing what's wrong. It's about acting on what matters most, and to be doing this in a way that is sustainable, right? So talking about being sustainable and taking that action, let's dig deeper into the mobilize phase, right? So now you're going to define workflows for remediation. You're going to try automation wherever possible. And you have to have sustainable security process so that you can keep going through this cycle as rinse and repeat. So, let's take some time to walk through specific actions that folks can take from a mobilized standpoint.
I think first of all, you're going to have something that you can measure against, right? So establishing metrics and KPIs are really important here. So, things like time detection, remediation time itself, and then even monitoring, reduction in organizational exposure risk scores are really important, not only to know where you're at any given time, but also we've seen a lot of organizations almost gamify that set of metrics to really inspire collaboration, and innovation even in that remediation and mitigation stages. So I think that also brings up another point that collaboration across departments in any organization, whether that be security, IT, operations, risk, compliance, is really key here. You really need to act as one team so that you can action on any kind of remediation or mitigation and then measure it against that set of metrics or KPI. If you can instill that security is everyone's responsibility, that shared accountability really helps drive the security and even the compliance posture of the organization. And then you mentioned automation. Automation, I think, is really key here, especially when we're talking about the rate at where the attack surfaces are expanding, the number of endpoints under management. Anytime that we can use automation for a rapid response or remediation is key. And part of that is having all of an organization's security solutions, security and operations solutions integrated wherever possible. So as part of your exposure management system, if you can integrate a CMDB, even incident response systems, I think that's going to be a big win as far as gain efficiencies and responsiveness. And then go ahead, Bindu.
No. I was just going to reiterate, it's not just a standalone function, right? So I think that is key.
Yeah. And then, like you had mentioned earlier, Bindu, this is a process, right? So providing feedback and having that iterative process again and again really helps you continuously refine an exposure management program.
Yeah. So that's great. So, and I think that's a perfect cue to our, next slide where, we're really talking about this not in a silo, right? So this is not something that's just sitting within a function where, you really don't know what to do with the sort of input and output of those, right? If you see this chart, this is the central function, and it's actually connecting governance, risk, and compliance, threat detection, as well as risk mitigation, right? So what's happening here, right? So typically, if you think about a governance, risk, and compliance program that is set up within an organization, that's where you'll have what the risk threshold looks like, what your policies are, and GRC is actually going to inform exposure management, because how do you know what your exposure looks like if you don't know what your risk thresholds are, or what your policies look like, or what is defined as acceptable use versus not? Then whatever the output that you get from the exposure management, which is all of those insights, will influence GRC, because now you've identified certain gaps. It has to go into your risk register and be able to, again, it's that cyclical approach. So one is feeding to the other. So you're able to not just look at this as a one-time assessment, a siloed activity that your sort of security team is doing, but it's really about influencing your overall security strategy and risk posture, right? So if you have to look at this, it's about it being an integrated system and not just a bunch of siloed efforts that you're doing. Then, when Clint was talking, he spoke about how this feeds into incident response, it feeds into threat detection and response. And the reason we are actually showing you this is, sometimes we sort of get enamored by a certain tool that's giving us the ability to just be able to scan and patch systems, and we do both, right? So we are able to do vulnerability assessments, go beyond that, help teams with patching. But more importantly, this is not about just doing a whole bunch of siloed activities within an organization. So oftentimes you talk to organizations that'll be like, oh, we use XYZ tool for, conducting our vulnerability scans, and, we use another team to be able to patch. Then, we at times do a pen test, but we don't take our full org into account. We'll just do it based on a certain set of assets because of a compliance need. And then there'll be some others that want to sort of scale up that maturity curve, may do red teaming, but then define a very limited scope that, again, sort of significantly exposes them more, and not really look at it from sort of a security posture optimization view, right? So all of these efforts that we typically do within an organization as part of security functions need to talk to each other. And, this is not just for, a cool visual where things are feeding into each other. And as security folks, we like workflows, we like flow charts, right? But this truly has to all sort of enrich your overall ability to get a view into what your threats look like that are specific to you. Having been in this space for, like a good 25 years now, the reason we are still talking about phishing emails, still talking about 0 days, still talking about, non-patched vulnerabilities being exploited is also because a lot of these functions are done as one-offs. And you'll see that, there's this accurate asset inventory is lacking in many organizations. So if I were to ask you, can you give me all of your assets that are critical to your business function? And can you give me a list of every third party in a prioritized manner that has access to those assets that can be seen and updated on an ongoing basis? And when I mean ongoing basis, it cannot just be once a year for compliance purposes. A lot of us will have to say, no, we haven't been able to keep up, right? So that's why sort of this, ability to visually see how all of this works together is key. Because again, this is not just about, I'm just going to go ahead and grab the best tool in the market out there that can currently do exposure management for me, deploy it, and then call it a day, right? If only security was that easy, right? We wouldn't be talking about the types of attacks and breaches that we still see today. Right? Clint, anything to add here?
I would just say, I like this slide a little bit better even than that wheel of life. This really kind of, I think, illustrates that everything is in motion simultaneously, right? We get one question about, do we do vulnerability assessments or do we also do patching? If you think back to that wheel of life we just talked through, all of those different phases within that should be active at any given time in an organization. They may be worked on by different teams, right? But I think one of the differences, that we've seen in the transition from vulnerability management to exposure management is that we're trying to do things, continuously as quickly as possible. So, like for instance, on this site, when this enrichment prioritization is happening, in as near real time as possible, all at once. There's not any gates that these different functions are waiting on, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. So I think, I hope we've impressed upon you that, we have to evolve from vulnerability management to exposure and vulnerability management. And again, not treat this as a silo, it's a connected functionality. And I think Danyel is the perfect segue into our key takeaways here. Yeah, and before I get there, I think we've touched on a few of this, but let me just, sort of quickly do a recap, right? So as LevelBlue, we are really proud to be able to serve our customers across a variety of services. In this case, you'll see that we do all types of assessments, strategy, and roadmap development. We do compliance assessment. We are heavily focused on helping our customers reduce their risk exposure. We are well equipped to be providing services in the network and cloud security space. We have our managed detection and response, our MDR services. And our latest in the line, which is evolved, is the exposure and vulnerability management. And you asked, we saw a question from the audience about, do we just do the vulnerability assessment or do we also do the patching? You'll see here, we can take you through that entire life cycle and be part of a customer's journey. We've had customers who've started with us as just a scanning customer to evolving and becoming a scanning and patch management customer, to then, sort of growing up that maturity curve, adding other assets such as their web applications. We do attack surface management. We help our customers deal with all types of penetration testing, whether it is network, internal, external, going through the web applications. We have a customer recently that we've been working on a lot about OT testing. We have customers that are engaging with us after years of, typically doing the scanning, patch management, typical pen testing. Now they're, trying us for things like red teaming, very popular now, given the types of attacks that we're seeing. We have customers that have their internal blue team, and use an external SOC. So they use us for the purple teaming efforts. Cloud security monitoring. Again, we have a number of customers since the COVID days that have implemented, cloud solutions, but, haven't really taken stock from a security standpoint, want us to monitor it on an ongoing basis. The number of Office 365 related assessments that we're doing we're seeing an uptick there. Social engineering, an interesting dynamic there, especially with the influence of AI. We are seeing more of these social engineering engagements that customers are coming to us with. So what we want to, tell you all is, all of these initiatives, all of these sort of cyclical approach, that process, right? You don't have to go at it alone, right? I'm sure that there are many organizations that have to do more with less now. Teams are sort of short-staffed. If you want to achieve economies of scale, you want to be able to, use some of the best practices that we've learned serving across multiple customers. Talk to us. You'd be surprised that, what you'd find is the value that you're able to get from a service provider that can do this exposure and vulnerability management for you and help you sort of have that sustainable workflow and automation, could be of a significant value versus, having a full-blown team doing it all in-house. Of course, the business context and the ability for you to map out your risk still resides with you, and you have the control. But the ability for us to be able to, do this for customers at scale has been something that we have seen significant success with. And with that, now let's do the key takeaways, Danyel.
Yep. Sorry about that. Okay. So I know, Bindu, you just touched on some of this, but a couple things that we really wanted to call out and make sure that we gave emphasis to for the takeaways of our time together today was on the left side, you'll see the operational foundation of what an effective exposure and vulnerability management program looks like. And the right side is the strategic benefits that you would receive. So, for example, thorough scoping would deliver resilience against the expanding attack surface. With a continuous comprehensive assessment and the categorization of your assets, you'd be able to have a resilient cybersecurity framework. With continuous discovery and monitoring, you would go from that reactive to proactive stance that Bindu and Clint talked about. With the automation and streamlining of your security processes, you would be able to have easier reporting and just more ease and accurate reporting. And then, of course, having, this one's wrong, but being closely aligned with business objectives and risks that Clint was referencing earlier as well, is just being able to have that adaptive security posture. So with that said, that concludes our presentation. And I know we've got a couple questions that have came up in the chat while Clint and Bindu and I were speaking. So we will open it up. If you held on to your question, pop it in the chat and we will answer it. All right. So oh, go ahead. Yeah. No, go.
Yeah. So Danyel, we just saw a question there, so I thought I'll take this one and then I'll turn it to you. So based on our definition of exposure management, do we think security awareness and training is also part of exposure management, right? And that's a great question, right? So I think I'd say, while, when I was talking, I called out user behavior, the ability for us to prioritize based on user behavior risks. So, for example, if a phishing simulation results show that a high percentage of employees are falling for it, that means that becomes a critical exposure that you have to address through targeted training. So as part of mobilizing your team you have to have actionable security training so that we know how to respond to these identified exposure. So whether it is unpatched system, user errors, or misconfiguration, awareness and training is an element, that is part of this. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so let's take another one. We have quite a bit, so I will try to do our best to get to them all with our time we have. So what is the best approach to manage vulnerabilities in third-party systems and services that we rely on but don't directly control?
You want me to start on this one, Bindu?
Yes.
So I think there's a couple of things to remember here. Some of that may be governance in that there will be some assurances that they can give you. It may be a third-party audit with a certification that shows at least at a point of time that they were compliant or their associated security and compliance posture. But keep in mind, there's also some solutions out there. So, for instance, if there's a website, there are some solutions that LevelBlue even supports that allows us to get between the internet and that web application. We can provide, in effect, mitigation and compensating controls. So there are solutions out there that let you not only correct maybe an unpatched third-party web app, but also protect against flaws even in business logic or something like that.
Awesome. All right, let's take another one. How should security leaders evaluate and implement the growing categories of attack surface management tools, but while avoiding solution sprawl?
I'll start with this with you, Bindu. So I think that you can look at some solutions out there that are from one vendor that are really broad. So solution sprawl doesn't necessarily, I know expanding attack surface doesn't necessarily mean that you need yet another solution. A lot of these exposure management solutions that are out there by the leading vendors are keeping pace with the expansion of that attack surface. So whether it's AI and LLMs that are part of your environment, social media usage, even exposures on the dark web, it's not that hard these days to find an all-in-one solution that'll really help your exposure management program from one vendor.
Awesome. So I will rapid fire. Here's the next one, y'all. All right. So how are organizations successfully managing vulnerability prioritization across diverse international operations with different regulatory requirements and risk appetites?
Yeah, and I can take this one. So I think it actually goes back, to that first scoping aspect that we were talking about. When you have your assets that you're defining and you're talking about how that GRC function would, sort of feed into your exposure and vulnerability management, those policies, those risk requirements, part of your risk register feeds into your exposure management program. So obviously, your controls that you put in place, we talked about how exposure management includes the people, process, and technology. So your controls for assets, let's say, that are impacted by an international regulation, such as the GDPR, may be different from, what you have in here for, let's say a HIPAA, right? So that GRC function would feed into your exposure and vulnerability management area, which is how you prioritize, based on the different types of assets mapped to the context, which is mapped to your risk appetite, which is mapped to the compliance regulation you're dealing with.
Awesome. Okay. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to take one more. How do we effectively communicate security priorities to business units that don't speak the language of CVEs and CVS scores?
Answer is easy. Communicate it in terms of risk and impact, right? So, and I'd say, and I know I'm probably simplifying this, but I really do mean it that, as a security team, if you cannot explain in plain English about what the impact is, and I'm not saying that we have to always go the quantification route in terms of, loss value or, asset, criticality and value. At the end of the day, if you cannot really talk about it in terms of business risk, then you're going to definitely lose an audience that doesn't do this on a day-to-day basis. And I'll give you an anecdote. Years ago, when I started my career, now about 26 years ago, my job as an analyst was to review IDS logs. And I had to go to the CIO every evening after reviewing these IDS logs and give a report. And as an analyst, I would have spent the entire day, really reviewing these IDS logs and going through the source IP, the destination IP, the activity. And after a week of again, right out of college, working this gig, and he asked me, "So what? So you're doing this, and you're showing me these logs, and you have all these entries that you're coming to me with. Can you just explain the so what? Why should I care about this?" And of course, being a novice at that security job, I had a hard time trying to articulate that in terms of what is the true risk? Why should they care? Right? So outside of the tactical team that is patching these CVEs, and if you've ever been in the SOC or dealt with like any type of incident response, if you walk up to somebody else that doesn't do the tactical function and you talk to them about mean time to detect, mean time to respond, and give them these metrics, it really doesn't register, right? Because for them, they see it as, is my organization going to be up and running? Am I going to serve customers? Am I losing revenue? Am I going to be in the news? What's going to happen, right? If you can really communicate it in terms of risk, I think that is the best way for getting the right type of attention that we need on it. Clint, if you just want to chime in.
No, I think that was perfect.
Okay.
Great answer, Bindu.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we are definitely at our time, and I think there were a couple more questions we didn't get in the chat. So guys, if you had anything that we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out to us after this call, and we will absolutely reach out and get you an answer. We really, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Bindu. Thank you, Clint, for an amazing presentation. I wish everybody, wherever you are, an amazing rest of your day and weekend, and have a good day. Thanks. Bye.